Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. This is organized by BAF and the Blockchain Club at University of Washington. I'm Noor, I'm project manager at BAF, and I would like to start off with some background about BAF and what we do. The Blockchain Acceleration Foundation is a 501c3 nonprofit that starts university-accredited blockchain courses. We build projects, we connect our members to opportunities in the industry. And what's very cool about BAF is that we are governed by the leaders of our affiliated university blockchain clubs. We're very thankful for all the support that we get from our sponsors who made our work possible. BAF is actually funded by Algorand Foundation, Protocol Labs, Ethereum Foundation, and our incredible individual sponsors.
I can give a quick introduction on us. So for me, I'm the president of the Bothell chapter of UW Blockchain Society. And Marie?
And I'm the president of the UW Seattle chapter of the Blockchain Society.
So yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. And before we start, I'll also give like a quick intro on decentralized storage. So basically, decentralized storage is where data is stored on a decentralized network, and it's stored across multiple locations and computers by users or groups who are incentivized to join, store, and keep that data accessible. A lot of our questions today are going to be kind of focused on that concept and how Filecoin and Protocol Labs sort of like utilize that.
Okay, so basically, we're going to start with a few questions for you, Jonathan. My first question is for you is, can you just give us an overview of Protocol Labs and why and how did you launch Filecoin as one of your projects?
Yeah, so that's a bigger question than you may realize. So Protocol Labs is a research, development, and deployment lab. If you listen to talks that Juan, who's our CEO, has given, his sort of vision for Protocol Labs is like, how do we build an institution that can sort of be like Bell Labs 2.0, thinking about like super long-term R&D, ideally like matching that to specific business cases, but really focusing on like the intersections where computing has the ability to like substantially improve humanity. And so like in a very abstract sense, that covers actually many different things. I think in the most immediate term, that's very focused on Web3 technologies, but that spans, like we have teams that are doing like research on like very far future things like decentralized energy, brain-computer interfaces, things like that. Those are like separate, but I think like it hopefully sets some of the context of like when Protocol Labs is thinking about like the projects that we work on and like the research, a lot of this stuff is like, what does humanity look like in 2050? And then much more practically, like how do we both do the R&D to set the stage for those technologies, as well as like the practical implementation of actually pushing things out, which Web3 is like the core focus today. And so, yeah, I think for Filecoin itself, it's actually better to start maybe with IPFS. Would folks be familiar with IPFS? Is it useful if I give like a quick intro of what that is?
You might want to give us a little bit of an intro.
Yeah, so IPFS stands for the Interplanetary File System. And so the best way to sort of describe it is if you think about how the internet works today, when you reference content and you say like, I'm going to go to google.com, like what you're actually saying is I'm going to a specific like server, some location somewhere, and I'm going to trust that the content there represents the thing that I want it to, which is hopefully google.com. And like if you thought of that as like an analogy to how do you request like a book, if we were talking about a book like To Kill a Mockingbird and you wanted to read it, if I told you to like fly to London, go to the center of town, middle of the square, there's like a book library with a bookshelf, 3 books from the right, that's the one that you want. Like many things could go wrong. Like you could get denied boarding to like going to London, the library could have burned down, someone could have put something else there. Like these are things that happen on the internet today, just purely from like, how do we do this sort of like referencing of like, what is the thing that we're looking for and how do we grab it? What IPFS tries to do is invert the question, which instead of saying like, where do you go for content? It asks, what content are you looking for? So inside of IPFS land, everything is referenced by what's known as a CID, which is a very specific fingerprint of the content itself. And you can just think of it as like a very descriptive way of saying like, I'm looking, like it is actually like a cryptographic hash of the data, like a Merkle-DAG thing. But like really what it allows you to do is to say, when I'm asking the IPFS network for a specific CID, I'm asking for a very specific description of the thing I'm looking for. And regardless of where it's stored, whether it's stored on your local computer, whether it's stored on like someone's AWS server, whether it's stored on someone else's laptop, like you should be able to request and retrieve that content. And like, to go back to our analogy of To Kill a Mockingbird, like if instead of me telling you where to go, I told you like, this is a book written by Harper Lee, it's got this many pages, it's got whatever very specific ISBN number, you could ask like your buddy, you could ask me, and if I have it, I could give it to you. You could ask like, I don't know, your sister, your brother, like anyone, and if they don't have it, they could ask someone else. And when you get the thing back, you can always verify that the book that you got is the one that you want. Because you can check all those properties to make sure it matches the original description that I gave you. And so like the important part with IPFS is it really uncouples where data needs to live from the actual like application itself. And it lets you rethink how applications could be designed altogether. One important problem with IPFS, and like to set the stage for Protocol Labs, like IPFS was the first thing that like Juan sort of came up with. And then there was a bunch of sub-problems as IPFS was being built, which became pretty obvious that they should be broken out as their own protocols. So the first of those would be like libp2p, which is like when we start thinking about how do we do that asking question, so like how do we pass things around the network, it becomes obvious that you sort of need like a modular way of sort of swapping between nodes to say, yeah, maybe one node wants to talk to another in Bluetooth, another might want to do it over WebRTC, but like this should be something that's totally interoperable, so you don't have to like specifically say like, oh, we only serve one or two or n protocols. Filecoin came out of actually trying to answer a very specific question for IPFS, which when you think about IPFS, it gives you this guarantee of saying, if I have at least one copy of the data on the network up to n copies, I can ask the network for a copy of it and someone will give it back to me. But it doesn't solve the 0 to 1, which is to say, how do I know that the content is on the network to begin with? And really that's where Filecoin comes in. Under the hood, Filecoin speaks IPFS. And it also like does all the cool IPFS, libp2p stuff. But like the main important point in the primitive that it adds is this like crypto economic system that allows basically for cryptographic guarantees, which you can like verify the existence of this data, and economic guarantees that like can allow you to trustlessly like store data on this network and know that the content will be persisted for the duration of that deal. Sorry, that was a roundabout answer, but that's sort of like how did Protocol Labs come to Filecoin? It really was motivated from this idea of like, how do we build a peer-to-peer internet? And like, how do we solve specific problems inside of there?
I see. Great. Also, like, would you be able to like walk us through the Protocol Labs infrastructure and ecosystem, and as well as like the different projects you have going on?
Yeah, so it's interesting. We try to build things as modularly as we can. And so these things all sort of like interoperate with each other. So like IPFS is really this, and the interesting thing, because these are modular, is you can sort of like pick and choose what are the components that you need. I think this enables people to be able to do things that are like practical today and like figure out like what are the pieces that allow them to do the things that will like make them successful, and then like swap them out for things that they might want to do in the future. A very concrete example of that is like when you're working with IPFS, you might want to like hire someone to run the node for you, but because everything is speaking CIDs, you have the complete ability to port off, and like your application doesn't break if you have to like migrate providers. If you want to run the infrastructure yourself, like it untethers you from this like lock-in scenario. But yeah, so like in terms of the infrastructure and ecosystem, so I guess maybe to zoom out one level, what would be most interesting when we say infrastructure? Are we talking about like the different systems that exist? Are we thinking about like what is like the stack of protocols, or?
I was thinking like kind of like a mix of both. Like I'm also interested in like this, like the stack of protocols you have.
Yeah, so I think like IPFS is probably like the top layer that most people are familiar with. And then under the hood, IPFS uses things like IPLD, which is a way of like interpreting. So IPFS, when you stick data into IPFS, you're creating a Merkle DAG, like you're structuring the data into like a graph. And you can do some cool things with protocols like IPLD, which allows you to basically define standards for how you want to interpret that data. And when you can have like IPLD codecs that are attached to these graphs, it gives you ways of building tools that allow you to do things like write query languages and like actually have standards around like what can you actually like interpret the data for. And so this becomes really powerful if you think about things like, I want to index like the Bitcoin blockchain, have every individual block be something that you can query into for each individual transaction. Using something like IPLD, you could write a codec that allows you to take every block as its own graph and have a consistent way of basically accessing the information inside. So IPLD is like sort of a thing that sits on like adjacent. It's used with IPFS. IPFS itself is a consumer of libp2p. libp2p being this like modular transport layer, which allows you to basically like pass information around a peer-to-peer network. People can write other transport layers in. So like there was a team Birdie that did the Bluetooth implementation. Like anything that like allows you to transfer data, you could feasibly write into libp2p as like a way of like whale sounds. Like you could do it. And then Filecoin sort of like intersects with these. If you think of Filecoin as just like special IPFS nodes, like Filecoin just has specific crypto economic primitives there that allow you to like know that these nodes are doing a specific thing because they're running the specific protocol. There's like many other protocols that are like sub things. Like DRAND is like a distributed randomness beacon that like Filecoin consumes as part of its proofs, or like how it actually generates. It's not really part of the proofs, but it's part of the protocol for like timing things. But yeah, so I guess there's a long list of all the protocols. Oh, hey, we have a Clara. But yeah, so yeah, and the high level is like, hopefully most people don't have to really think about this stuff. There's people who build tools. Like Filecoin is a very low level protocol. I think sometimes people think it's like a Dropbox type thing. And really it's closer to like, how do you build, if what Ethereum is like a distributed computer that's permissionless that anyone can use, Filecoin is a distributed hard drive that anyone can use. And it's like very low level. And so like many of the services that people build on top are really just about how do you make this as user-friendly and as accessible as possible? And how do you give it like a nice wrapper so people can interface it with it like it's IPFS without having to get into the low weeds.
Nice. Okay, well, and another question we had too for you, Jonathan, was about Protocol Labs. Do you all work with different blockchains? And if so, how do you work with those different chains?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. So many blockchains do not think about storage. Like, so we are complementary as an ecosystem to many other ecosystems. If you think of NFTs as a very specific use case, like when you have an NFT, the way that it works is you have a token on one of these other blockchains, and that token typically has a reference. It's pointing to something. And so the reason they have to point to something is just storing a file directly on Ethereum is insanely expensive. It's like super expensive. And so having somewhere where you can point immutably and say like, I am referencing some picture, IPFS is fantastic for that, but it doesn't solve this other problem that says, how do I know someone's going to keep this content around? Which is where Filecoin solves a different problem. And so I think the interesting thing about Filecoin is it ends up complementing a lot of the, you may have heard the term metaverse, like all of this like gaming stuff, like anyone who's generating these digital assets. I think like you need to have, because most L1s are not trying to store data directly on them, you need somewhere to like host that content, which is where IPFS and Filecoin can be really helpful.
Awesome. We were also wondering if you could tell us more about the Web3 and the plans that Protocol Labs has for it.
Yeah, I mean, well, I'll give you a few. So I think there's like 3 specific things that I'm super excited about. I don't know full time horizons on these, but hopefully they will be in some time next year. So thing number 1, I think this is not specifically like the things that like are happening in Filecoin, but are related to Filecoin. I think NFTs and gaming are going to be quite important. I think the way, as we think about like what NFTs can be, like right now we mainly think about like art or like more expensive assets, and that's purely a function of like minting costs and storage costs. And like the cool thing about Filecoin is it, because of its crypto economic model, it's incredibly cheap to store. Like for a different slide, I was trying to like pull the numbers. I think the best way of representing it is like scientific notation to get to like the per terabyte per year cost. It's like literally a rounding error. And so like that unlocks a massive amount of use cases in terms of thinking about like, if I want to build a AAA game that interfaces with a blockchain, like I want an NFT that's an AR or VR asset, like you need super cheap storage to make that happen. And if you want like 1 billion NFTs so people can have tickets or your vaccination cards or any, like you need to have very cheap digital storage, which is something that I think naturally plays to like what our ecosystem has been working on, which is like one general theme I'm super excited about. And like gaming in general, I think is just capitalizing on like DeFi was a trend individually validated, NFTs was a trend individually validated. Gaming is like a multi-$100 billion industry where people already buy skins in like Fortnite and like pay like tokens. Like you sort of see the trends and they all kind of like make sense together. So it sort of makes sense that like if you can build the right product suite around it, like crypto gaming is just the same thing as closed source gaming, but with the added feature that you can like exit with liquidity or like, yeah, port to another game if you want to. So I think that's an interesting theme. A second theme I think is super cool is like actually expanding the definition of who's building in Web3. So actually, since you all are at UW, like one of the interesting things I think is like we've been working a lot with like research institutions, public interest data sets. One of the really compelling things about like Web3 storage is it is a two-sided market. Like you can come in as a consumer only and you can do the exact same thing that you could do with the cloud. I think the other thing that's fascinating is you can come in both as a provider as well. And like if you're an institution like you have an HPC, you could come in on both sides of that market where like you can use the on-prem resources that you have and you can scale like it is the cloud. And so especially when you start thinking about what does it mean to store public data and like public science, or like at your university, there are researchers who are doing research today that have a requirement from the NSF to hold on to data for 10 years. And if your budget was like, I don't know, like 5K to store the data, how do you actually do this like cheaply enough and actually make it accessible for other researchers who might want to consume your research? If you look at like how cloud business models work today, it's incredibly like, like you could put everything in Amazon and then every researcher who wants access to like scientific data has to pay the bandwidth fees. And I think like Web3 gives us additional properties that allow us to think more creatively about how do we do resource allocation. Like you could have a network of research universities that are independently coordinating to host copies of these data sets and offering their own bandwidth at cost to researchers. You could set up a DAO that has like funds that are able to like do micropayments to compensate universities for whatever like actual like resource utilization is happening. And you can go to the open market when you need to, if you need additional capacity. And on top of this, you get like additional benefits from like the subsidy that is the block reward just by people participating in the network, which helps drive the cost down to basically right now, as I mentioned, scientific notation you store terabytes per year. And so I think you put all these trends together and that gets really compelling when you start thinking about what does this mean to actually create a robust like foundation for humanities information? If we're trying to make like cultural institution data, open science data, like CERN right now has 100 petabytes of data. We have about 12 times that. Clara can correct me. We have 100, no, we have 12 exabytes. They have 100 petabytes. Yeah. How many CERNs can we store, Clara? Like,
you can store like 4 times all the. I have a statistic. I'll find before I talk.
Cool. But a lot of storage is, I guess, the main point. And I think like this is kind of the power of thinking about how do you design crypto economic incentives to like align to like the outcomes that you sort of want. And so it's definitely different. I'm not saying it's necessarily better in all forms. I think the interesting orthogonal thing that we have here are like different business models that can be more community oriented and allow people to contribute resources on both sides. And then the last theme, which is sort of related to that, is just like, yeah, DAOs in general. I think this is something that Filecoin is working on smart contracts. I think this is going to be incredibly powerful in many different directions. And I think to the thing I was saying before, just managing resources and being able to do that in a permissionless way, I think it, one, reduces a lot of complexity, although that may sound kind of counterintuitive. But like when you start thinking about, think about CERN and what it takes to have many different governments pull together capital in order to like fund a single institution, like you could do that trivially with smart contracts. And I think that's like the really powerful thing about crypto, where it's like you have this ability to pool capital and like do it in a way that does like minimizes trust. But I'll pause there. That was a lot of words.
Cool. And I know you touched on this a little bit, Jonathan, but could you elaborate more on how decentralized storage kind of plays into Protocol Labs' plans for Web3?
Yeah, I mean, like So I think pretty deeply. I spend a lot of time both on the NFT gaming side and how do we get more Web2 people, like research institutions, cultural institutions, thinking about Web3. And I think a lot of this really revolves around like how do we anchor. Like I think there's many powerful ideas in crypto, and I think the main question is like how do you bridge that to the real world? And I think storage is one of the most concrete and actually important places for that, given how much like we live online and how much data is actually generated. And so I think one of the same way NFTs brought artists into the space when it comes to like actually thinking about Web3 and like what are the principles and why does this matter? You have a set of like non-crypto natives that came in. I think the same thing will happen when we start thinking about like what is the value prop we can add or offer to additional users that are out there. Whether you're a researcher who's just trying to store your data, you may not even care that the fact that it's Web3, it just happens to be better than the alternatives. And like, to me, that's like the use cases that I'm focused on. And I have like incredible conviction that, yeah, this is like a more sustainable path.
Great. Awesome. One last thing, Jonathan, could you also tell us like about some products and integrations that you find the most interesting?
Yeah, in our ecosystem or like generally just across the board in Web3?
I guess like you can start with like your ecosystem, and then I guess like later on you could also tell us more about ones outside of that.
Yeah, I think so. One of the cool ones, so we have a team called the Application Research Group. They're basically building sort of like test products that like they support, but it's like experimental, just trying to see like what are things that we can do with the technology. And they built a tool called Estuary. I'll put it in the chat, which is pretty cool. It's like a hybrid IPFS and Filecoin node, which allows someone to use it as if it was IPFS. They can use a hosted Estuary node as like a pinning node, so they can send content to something someone else runs, but you can also run it yourself if you want to. And it like greatly abstracts the complexity of doing stuff with Filecoin, and it creates this like pretty seamless layer where like you can just treat this thing as if it was IPFS, and it can like manage pushing stuff into Filecoin for you. It can manage doing the retrieval out of Filecoin for you. It just kind of like works. And so I think that is like a really interesting innovation, just as like order models that can enable sort of like better interaction for users. So like if I'm thinking about how I get an HPC at one of these universities potentially to like take a look at IPFS and Filecoin, I think having to like run many different services in parallel, like no one wants that to be like a day job. And I think having something that's super like packaged makes it really nice and easy for folks to say like, okay, I deploy this one thing, and then they don't even have to do the storage side because these are open networks. They could like have someone else store it and then just like import the deal information into a local node, and then they can just manage retrievals only. So I think like the cool thing about like Web3, we also have these like different ways of like potentially operating. And so in our case, I think you get this interoperability and this ability to just like abstract parts of the problem away from people while still giving them the same benefits.
Nice, nice. Well, I think that's all of our questions for now, Jonathan, before the panel. But now I have some more questions for Clara, actually. So Clara, if you could basically just introduce us to the Filecoin Foundation and basically the goals that you have in the space of decentralized storage and beyond, that would be great.
Yeah, so first off, can everyone hear me? I'm so sorry for my issues earlier. I was using an iPad Pro and it wasn't compatible with this particular software. So first off, I would start off by saying here's a history of where Protocol Labs is and where Filecoin Foundation is, because I think there's a lot of confusion over what is the difference, and do JB and I really know each other? Are we strangers? Are we frenemies? Who are we? And so Protocol Labs was started several years ago, but in 2017 wrote a white paper over the thesis of the cryptocurrency Filecoin, right, as that incentive layer behind a decentralized web. And the analogy that I like to give that JB may have touched upon earlier, is really one between couchsurfing and Airbnb. So couchsurfing, as some of you guys might be familiar with, was around where people with altruistic intent with extra couch space could host people. And they loved it because of this vibrant community of people that really wanted to give the best experience to everyone around the world. But that unfortunately is not necessarily scalable. And so when Airbnb came into the picture, Airbnb allowed people to not only feel incentivized because they paid all the hosts to upgrade their space to host people, but also people were incentivized to actually even buy additional apartments or places to actually store other people because they could get incentivized by it. And so that was really what 2017 was with the Filecoin white paper, was really introducing Filecoin, talking about, if the equivalent of Airbnb had a token, if there was an Airbnb token, where you can stay at other Airbnbs and pay in that token, that's really what Filecoin is in the storage layer space. So the foundation has been around since that white paper as an idea, but there were not really any kind of legs to run this idea of whoever actually creates Filecoin should actually not be the one that governs it. We need a neutral body that's credible. And so that is where the foundation really came in. So around a year and a half ago, myself and my co-founder Megan, we really put the legs behind staffing up the Filecoin Foundation and really bringing on board, thinking about governance, and really thinking about what it means to make the economics of Filecoin work. And so our mission is really, really simple. We are trying to really make sure that at the end of the day, with everyone that is in our ecosystem, we can disappear one day and the ecosystem will run itself. And that means a lot of steps on the way. We need to make sure that the incentive models that we've created for everyone that's the storage providers, the 3,300 storage providers all around the world today, they feel incentivized, right? The economics are there for them to continue to host files. That means we are giving out grants to make sure that we have a vibrant developer ecosystem. We're thinking about strategic partnerships so that we can also scale at a level that we really think is necessary for Filecoin to be successful. And then also, this is where JB and I work closely together, is we're bringing on really incredible clients that really believe in our mission, that want to store humanity's most important information on our network, that we feel like are not mutable due to anything else. And for most of you guys, to put it into even more concrete words, many of you guys remember October 4th, Facebook experienced an outage. For those that like to Facebook scroll, Instagram scroll, that was all broken. And for 5 hours, Facebook was inaccessible to 3.5 billion people. I mean, and I can access it. I love scrolling on Instagram when I'm bored in meetings, and I'm sure many of you guys are. And so, it was really this pinpoint where, what is it like for us to not be able to open doors on the web? And that's really something that we think about as that infrastructure layer for Web 3.0. How do we keep the most important information that everyone should have permanent access to constantly accessible? And the problem today is today's internet is very centralized, right? So Facebook's a great example. Everything is centralized. If Facebook has something broken, everything goes down. And so for us in our network of storage providers, we can never really go down. We have 12 exabytes of storage capacity as of a year ago, and we really want to build internet for everyone to really ensure that we can bring the most important information to everyone's hands and really be the steward of Filecoin's community. So I'll pause there, and that is why the foundation exists. So.
Thank you, Clara. We also have another question. So why did you decide to take on your role as leader of the Filecoin Foundation? And could you also tell us more about the role of the Filecoin Foundation in the blockchain space?
Yeah, absolutely. So I do want to correct that I am the co-leader. So I have a co-founder, Megan, who is unable to join us tonight. She's actually upstairs in this hotel I'm at, so she's here in spirit. But like I said, for me, I had spent the last few years of my career, actually the last decade, really trying to fix problems in Web 2.0. And at the end of the day, I worked in a field called trust and safety, where I was looking at everything from child pornography to terrorist content online to Russian bots taking on the web. And most companies today are putting band-aids over these solutions. They're trying to come up with either trust and safety teams, better tools for moderation, or even trying to think about how to create a healthier community to foster the right dialogue. But at the end of the day, the incentive of Facebook is to mine and monopolize data from users to be able to sell people's data to advertisers. We can't really fix everything else. Everyone is incentivized to have the most number of likes, the most number of bots, the most number of engagement, right? Because that's what's going to actually pay the bills one day. And most companies in the US, they are C Corps, meaning they are subjected to shareholders as their ultimate goal. And like it is actually illegal for companies to not necessarily do the best for the interest of their shareholders. So for me, that was a wake-up moment that unfortunately in today's web, incentive models are broken, and that is really where the community of people really thinking about Web 3.0, that's where they're trying to fix is, at the end of the day, it is Web 3.0, but really we're trying to fix incentives in a world where the web is truly decentralized. And the way to think about us is a lot of people get confused by the word foundation. There's many other examples of this in history, from the Apache Foundation to the Linux Foundation. Every open source project has a foundation arm that is independent from the people that created it to really ensure that there is a place for long-term governance and stewardship of it, right? And you cannot necessarily run a foundation from the same place that birthed it. Otherwise, you would say like, oh, well, clearly your incentives are to make sure this project is successful. But at the end of the day, like most open source projects are really, the stakeholders are the community. And so we were really created to really accelerate the growth of Filecoin and to make sure that we can also invest and make sure that everyone else in this ecosystem can be successful. We also have a sibling arm called the Filecoin Foundation for the Decentralized Web. This is a 501c3. So Filecoin Foundation is a C Corp technology company, and our nonprofit arm is really looking at how we can really invest in nonprofits and other charitable programs that help accelerate Web 3.0. And so we've given a number of donations and grants and sponsored a number of programs to really make sure that the infrastructure of the next web continues to be successful. And that arm really looks at long-term investment. So we gave a grant, for example, to places like Freedom of the Press Foundation, because for an open and decentralized web, we believe that the voices of journalists are so important. Or we funded a program called the Starling Lab, which is out of Stanford, which has brought close to 4 petabytes of Holocaust testimonials. We're still working through that, but onto the decentralized web, because the history of people that have gone through such terrible things in human history should never be manipulated or changed. And so we need a permanent place to store this. So we're working on that with the USC Shoah Foundation. So these are very clear examples of why Web 3.0 is beyond just decentralization or antitrust legislation. It really is also very much an important place where we believe that the web is just as important as physical libraries. It is a place for democratic information sharing, and it should not belong in a place where an organization has to be able to afford the price ceiling that AWS decides to put, or Azure, or any kind of centralized cloud service. It should really be driven by market forces, and it should be affordable and accessible to everyone, especially those organizations that are really trying to bring access to information for all. Nobody goes into a library, choosing to decide like, today my library book is $1, tomorrow it's $10, right? But that's unfortunately the downside of a centralized structure. So I will pause there.
Thank you. That was great with the examples. Another question, this is kind of a loaded question, so feel free to take your time with it, but can you explain like what inspired you to co-found the Filecoin Foundation? And then as a result, like how has it progressed over the past year, and what do you see in the future for the Filecoin Foundation?
Yeah, so for me, I love starting things from the ground up. And I also think it's a special moment to be part of the beginning of something. And I think everyone early on, whether it's the Filecoin Foundation, whether it's in our ecosystem, whether it's Protocol Labs, people love that. Some people like the tangible. They like to see like, hey, I launched a product and it's suddenly adopted by consumers. There's a place and time for that. But I think there is a really special place for everyone that likes to imagine the world a few years out and imagine how do we build the best incentives and infrastructure. And I'm very much in that boat. My co-founder is in that boat. We are both very much invested in making sure that we can create things that are built to last, and that we can really make sure that we start with good culture, good practices, from trust and safety to making sure we have the smartest and best developers in our ecosystem, to making sure our storage providers are prepared, right? And it's also very cool to kind of see this ecosystem evolve. And JB can jump in and add to this, but most people don't realize that development in the blockchain and crypto community is so fast. I mean, every month there's a million things happening in our ecosystem. And we have these monthly working group updates in our ecosystem where there's suddenly 5 projects that I had no idea was being developed that our partners are all behind, right? And so it's a very, very aggressive growth. And I think that's really exciting to people that love to kind of see things being built over time and being able to be part of the beginning of something that at some point around the Thanksgiving table, all of us, JB and I, will be able to explain what we do to our parents. But in the meantime, they will continue to scratch our heads and wonder why we didn't take lucrative jobs at Facebook, Google, or why we left those companies. So that is, I think that's the special energy that comes together with a lot of people that are in our ecosystem. Is people get it, they see the future, they understand that we can do better. Everyone around the world that don't have a voice, that aren't technologists or don't necessarily belong to centers of gravity for power, we are doing them all a service to really think about the next version of web that really allows them to have a seat at the table. So
I think it's great what the Filecoin Foundation is doing. Also, one last question before the Q&A panel. I was going to ask, what kind of users do you think are going to be using Filecoin, and what is your primary use case?
Yeah, I would say we have everyone. I hope everyone can use it, but I would say our earliest adopters are people that, a good analogy is like, I wouldn't say we go head to head with AWS, but people choose Firefox over Chrome, right? And it's not like Firefox screams at Chrome to say you were the worst browser. They don't do that, but people know that Firefox protects privacy, protects human rights, right? And protects personal data on the browser. And so for us, it's a similar thing. We really want to do the decentralized web right with the right ethos. And so we are working with a lot of people that truly believe that, for example, data storage should not necessarily belong in the hands of one single monopoly. And so they see a lot of value in a distributed data storage system for their data, right? And some of that could be cities, some of that could be libraries, some of that could be, institutions, some of that could be enterprise companies, right? But it is really very much this notion of we should not necessarily have all of our users' data accessible by one person, or it could be the instance of internet shutdowns all around the world, right? When COVID hit India, the Indian government tried to get some of the realities of what was happening in numbers shut down, or they threatened centralized companies for that. And this is such important knowledge and information that everyone has a right to know, that no government should ever intervene with the right, honest version of where history's at. So. Oh, I did want to mention, we also have a new website that launched this week. So if you go to phil.org, I can put that in the chat. You can read more about our work. We have a lot of things that we own. We give out a lot of grants. We have a number of partnerships. We are hiring. So if you are a new grad or looking for a job, or maybe a few years out, this might be the place for you. Definitely reach out, let us know. We'll keep your resume on our radar. We also have interns. And so if you guys are looking for internships just to get yourselves involved in the space, we're always open to that. So just send me a note. But definitely feel free to learn more, because we're so thrilled that all of you guys chose to show up today. So.
Thank you so much, Clara, on your presentation. Really appreciated it. Now we're quickly just going to go into a few Q&A questions for the panel. So either you or Jonathan can answer these, just kind of depending on what you choose. But I would say the first question that people have submitted is, where is data materially stored with IPFS?
Yeah, so I think it depends on how you're storing the data. So IPFS itself is just doing this content addressing thing. And so when you run an IPFS node, you could store the data locally on your own node. You could pin it to someone else's node. So there's a notion of like remote pinning. So you tell a buddy, if I want to send it to Clara, she could tell me what her peer ID is, and then I could like ask her to pin content for me. there's services that you can pay. So like Pinata is one, Infura is another. They host nodes that you can pin, but really the content can live anywhere. It also can that's the quick answer, is that it can live anywhere. And so when you're actually setting up your application and storing stuff, you sort of have to make a decision about, are you going to run infrastructure? Are you going to have someone else run infrastructure? The thing that Filecoin sort of adds to that is to say, if you use something like Estuary, like it'll like both pin it locally in an IPFS node, but then push it into Filecoin to someone, like have someone else be compensating like someone to pay for it. But yeah.
And our next question is asking, do you see the government or public administration using IPFS to store data?
I can jump in on this one. I definitely think so. I think there's so much important, for example, open data that exists today that are owned by governments that no IT budget should ever take away, right? There's a lot of people that believed early on in the open data movement that, you know, if someone gets cancer from like pollution, and that's in city data, and that information, that data set suddenly goes down, right? Like there's a lot of basic human rights and basically citizen rights, things that are dependent on the cloud today. And so I think absolutely, we want governments, we want enterprises, we want nonprofits, we want everyone to really understand what it means to have decentralized storage and to have democratic access to really critical information all around the world.
And maybe to like motivate that a little bit, I don't know if folks remember in 2016, so Trump got elected, and then there was this big question about, is he going to defund the EPA? Are all these climate data sets going to go offline? And like that's legitimately like the type of thing. There was actually a community of researchers that were archiving and using IPFS to pull down this data to make it more accessible. And like this is exactly the sort of thing where like, yeah, there's no reason not to use the infrastructure that the government has. They have servers. But one of the beautiful things about having things like IPFS and Filecoin is you don't have to trust some individual person to say like, oh yes, we will keep this data up. Like there are systems that like, for better or for worse, like can be like fallible. And so part of the premise of these technologies is that you really are trying to like abstract away the places where you like have to have specific trust.
Nice, thank you. And then another question is, basically somebody wants to know in terms of like, how easy is it for an index protocol like the Graph to be able to access information on IPFS and locate the needed content?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I don't know enough about how the Graph works, so we should start there. But what I do know about IPFS, I think, so inside the DHT, you can like make queries, and then you like can discover like what nodes know specific information. And so I assume they're doing something there. I think one of the things that gets challenging is you may not actually have like a full entirety of knowledge of what's happening. If nodes drop out of the network, that could change how accurate your index is. So I think it gets challenging, but I think the answer is you can still solve this. So the DHT itself helps like with routing and like creating better, this is, if you like computer science, there are many, many interesting challenges because this is a very early space. But like, yeah, there's questions about like, how do you more optimally do routing on the DHT? There's like different ideas people have about this. There's ideas of like doing like federated like overlays. There's other ideas about like, yeah, how do you just like reduce the load individually on the DHT? Like, so there's a bunch of different ideas about it. I think you can build an indexing node. I think the question is really a matter of like, how fast is the content growing on the network? How quickly, like part of the question is also for the Graph of like, because they are also building a decentralized protocol, how does that information propagate to the rest of the network? How do they get consensus about what's accurate? So a lot of very interesting implementation details to that question.
Another popular question in the chat is, how is decentralized data kept secure?
I guess there's two ways of defining secure. There's secure in the sense of like, I stored the data, I should be the only one who's retrieving the data, and I'm the only one who can read the data. That's like one definition. And then the other is like, how do I make sure that this data doesn't go away? How do I know that the data is like going to be there in a year, however much time I expect the data to be there for? And so for the first one, I think an important point about like how Filecoin works is it's actually quite unopinionated. Sort of the motivating philosophy there is like, you could choose whatever encryption algorithm you want. You could choose to pre-process your data. You could split it. You could erasure code it. You can make it like completely obfuscated to the perspective of the network. But the important reason to not do that as a part of the core protocol is because it then enforces like specific use cases. Like you would not be able to store public data if you enforced encryption without requiring some of the leaked keys, which would be kind of an odd design decision. So like from that perspective, like the Filecoin network is quite unopinionated, but like it's trivial to do things like encrypt your data before you use IPFS for Filecoin, to split the data and pre-process it, and like all of those things add layers of security. I will say like there is a difference, which is like in these decentralized networks, you still always have to then think about like your security model is completely inverted. So there's like there's different questions about like, yeah, how you want to handle it. I think the most secure, if you have something super private, encrypt it, erasure code it, then like the data literally is not interpretable in any way. But this other question of like, how do I make sure the data doesn't disappear? That's actually what the Filecoin protocol is for. Like at a super high level, the way Filecoin works is it basically enforces an on-chain SLA. If you want to provide storage capacity to the network, if you want to like offer your storage services, you are putting up a bond, like economic collateral. And in the event that you don't actually meet the SLA of the network, you don't prove that you're holding on to data the way that you claimed you would, you will get slashed and you will lose that money. Which, when you think about it, is actually the same thing like AWS and other services do. Like if you go on S3, you will see in their terms of service, they have like, if we have some amount of an outage, like we will compensate you based on like your bill or something, like some portion is free. Like we just enforce it programmatically, like, and it is done in a trustless way. And like the interesting thing there is like when you're doing this through a blockchain, anyone can participate, which means like you can have this long tail of storage provider, like including yourselves in your dorm room if you wanted to, so long as you're meeting the requirements of the network, like you can offer storage capacity to someone else, which is like the interesting, like how do you massively scale and grow a data center, like a virtual data center that is like grown at like exponential rates.
Nice, thank you. Another question that somebody put in was, what's the cost comparison for storing files on AWS, Google, Dropbox, etc.? And then also through like IPFS and Filecoin, and like which users do you anticipate will actually like pay the premium for decentralized storage?
That one, I mean,
Sure.
I think to add to what I said earlier, I think a lot of our early adopters are those that really care about a secure and distributed web. So a lot of early internet activists, you see a lot of groups that understand this, you see archival, scientific data and organizations. But JB, if you want to jump in on the cost side.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so there's a few things. So one, it's actually not a cost in the typical way you would think about it. I put a link in the chat for file.app. There's a team that basically is just scraping to like report what the prices are. It literally costs, I think, like 5 times 10 to the -4 like dollars per terabyte per year to store on file. It's super cheap. So Filecoin itself, and like the reason to explain is like the storage providers are compensated from 2 ways. One is like fees, one is block rewards. And right now, because it's early in the network, like the block rewards are sufficiently high, and like miners are incentivized to take client deals. So like they're willing to do it for free because it like increases their block rewards, which is like sufficient revenue source. Like, so from this perspective, like the interesting thing is like you now have a super cheap storage layer that just requires getting over the hurdle of learning about how to use Web3. So like that's the actual cost people are taking, which is like, how do we educate ourselves about these systems and use them? To the other question about IPFS, it actually depends because, as we said before, you can run an IPFS node anywhere. And so if you want to run it on your laptop, you could run it on a Raspberry Pi if you wanted to. So it really depends on like, what is the setup, what is your application, things like that. And so, yeah, I think people have different setups, and depending on like what use cases, they'll like pick different things. But you can make these things as low cost as you want to. You'll obviously like have a happier time if you're trying to ingest like a petabyte of data if you have a beefier machine. But like those can run on AWS. And the important part is that you're not locked into a specific API. Everything that you build is still talking CID. You can pull it from like whatever computer like the data eventually lives on. Yeah.
Additionally, someone also asked that pinning data and cache clearing in public gateways, and how do you avoid pinning for long-term storage?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. So the way that you do that is actually something like Estuary. So like sort of the grand vision of how this could work is like you could have an IPFS node that has some amount of capacity. And like the idea is that IPFS could be something closer to a hot cache rather than just being like the persistent storage. And instead you could like retrieve out of Filecoin. So like, I mean, think about like if you had, I'm going to pick really bad numbers on this, but like, let's just assume that like you have a small IPFS node that you keep all your like very recently accessed files like hot. And then if someone asks for something that's like much like you haven't touched in a long time, you don't have to have that also sit in your hot node. You can just retrieve that out of Filecoin and have that like be pulled into your hot cache. And like, that's actually what Estuary does behind the scenes. It has like an index where like it knows all the CIDs that have been made, like deals have been made for. And if someone asks it, it's not keeping all of them hot. It's only keeping like a handful of them. If someone asks it and says like, hey, I would like this specific CID, Estuary can check and say like, okay, do I have this already? If not, do I know where to get it? And if it does, it'll pull it out of Filecoin and then just like serve it to you.
Thank you. Another question that people want to know is, can you guys dive a little bit into proof of space and just elaborate on that a little bit?
Not with enough confidence that I'll get it correct. I mean, I can tell you like the high level of like what it's trying to do. Yeah, basically, so the idea with proof of replication is like you can provably send someone data and say, if I want to store 3 copies of my data, what I don't want you to do is tell me that you're storing 3 copies and you only store 1, and then I have a risk profile that I'm not aware of. So like proof of replication solves like this uniqueness thing to guarantee that like when I tell you to store like 3 copies, I can know for sure that you're storing 3 copies. The thing proof of spacetime does is basically require someone after they've sealed a sector, which happens during like the onboarding, like you send someone a deal, they'll seal deal into a sector. A deal like the proof of spacetime is like a proof that you do on top to just prove that like the content in that sector is still around. And so like they have to like, I forgot the exact ways that they have to like open up the leaves of the sector. It gets really crypto-y really fast. But like, yeah, like basically you can like, you're required to like on an ongoing basis, do a proof of spacetime to prove that the sector is like still healthy and that the data hasn't been dropped. And that's like what will trigger slashing if they forget or like they don't submit that in time.
Awesome. You have another question asking, how do you see most NFTs being hosted on IPFS in the future?
How do I see them, or what do you mean?
Yeah, I believe it's just like asking like I guess potential use cases for it being like hosted on IPFS.
Oh yeah. I mean, I think already there's quite a lot, and I think it's only going to expand. Like, so I think it's important to think of sort of like the market dynamics here. Like NFTs in the last year really sort of hit this like prominence. And the places where you see NFTs today is like, yeah, what are the main things? Like you see these stories about like $100,000, $1 million NFTs that are being sold. And when people think about the actual storage aspect of that, like, yeah, like it's reasonable that you might pay like higher amounts of money for that to be like a thing, like to secure it. However, I think the important question is like, what do we think NFTs will look like? And like, what does the median NFT look like today versus what does it look like in 10 years? And the median NFT today is probably like, honestly, probably like someone's profile pic of like a monkey or something that's like pixelated. But like in 10 years, I think it's highly likely that the answer is like, if we have the distribution where everyone has wallets, like NFTs are not going to be a specific thing. Like it's just going to be all of these like digital bearer asset type things that you have where it's like, yeah, if you have a vaccination card, there's no reason your vaccination card could not have been an NFT. That like, yeah, you can show, you can send around, like you can prove that it came from a specific smart contract, which is like the New York state government or whoever. Like, I think the idea of an NFTs is like this novelty thing will sort of wear off, and it will just be like, we have a bunch of everyday objects and we just need like specific properties out of them. And especially when you get to those like really boring use cases, which like it is now seeped into everyday life, the idea that like you need to store this stuff and you need it to be super cheap becomes incredibly important. Like, what would we be saying if like the cost of paper was like $10 a sheet? Like it's just completely unreasonable. So like the way that I sort of see this all evolving is like NFTs are going to be incredibly commonplace, not only because I think there's like very practical applications like tickets, like, yeah, the fact that you can like code into your NFT to say, or like the smart contract that processes an NFT to say like scalpers can't exist because all future profits will just go back to the artist. That's a great use case. I don't know why like concert or like artists would not gravitate to that because it leads to a better fan experience. The same is true for like Magic the Gathering cards. Anything with a secondary market, I think will, for economic reasons, become an NFT. And then gaming, like if games, like think of, if anyone has played like Cyberpunk 2077 or like Borderlands, there's like a bajillion in-game assets. And if every one of those is an NFT, it's unreasonable to imagine that someone's going to spend like millions of dollars in like storage costs when like the actual like physical drives are so cheap. And that's where I think like Filecoin and IPFS give you really unique properties where like IPFS create a unique fingerprint that's immutable. You can then choose as many storage vectors as you need to for the redundancy of your content. And then Filecoin just answers the question of how do I do this at the most cost-effective way possible? Pure open market economic model that like heavily subsidizes the cost of storage. Like I think all of those things sort of like align. But yeah.
Another question I had from the audience: are you doing anything in terms of cross-chain interoperability? Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, well, I don't know, Clara, if you have thoughts, but I have many. So there's a few. I think there's already some things that exist. So if you look at like, this is not built by Protocol Labs, this is built by the Textile team. Like ETH.storage, it also works with Polygon. Like these are bridges that allow you to like do actions on one chain to trigger storage deals on Filecoin. Chainlink has an integration as well. So like for everywhere Chainlink is like in existence, like you have an Oracle feed that allows you to like monitor deals and do things like that. I think like the interesting thing is like you actually don't need Filecoin to directly interoperate with other things because you can actually operate into sort of related but separate contexts and get most of the benefits that you care about. Like if you think about NFTs, like you're not linking a specific Filecoin deal. The thing that you're saying is like, here is a fingerprint of an image that I care about. And then as a separation of concern, I want to make sure independently that that content lives forever. And like, that's where Filecoin, like, so you can create your NFT in one context and then just like add your CID to a data DAO on Filecoin and say like, data DAO, please, and like perpetually fund the storage of this thing. And so like, I think the interoperability story, there's like, and anyways, yeah, so I think you can do things with bridges. I think bridges add different security constraints, which make it hard to do the exact thing that you want to do. But I actually think given the magic of CIDs and how IPFS works, like you can actually do all the storage and persistence entirely in Filecoin land, but have it support use cases in every other ecosystem, if that makes sense.
We'll let you guys watch this video. I just posted it in the chat. We call them in our ecosystem multipliers, how we really think about the ability to integrate with other ecosystems. And so it goes through a number of different examples in that YouTube video if you guys want to deep dive more. So.
Another question we have from the chat is, we're just wondering, are there any documents we can take away from the panel to read more in depth, like about, I guess like about Filechain, or sorry, Filecoin and Protocol Labs?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's definitely a lot. I would say we write a lot on our Filecoin blog. I would say the most important ones that I always recommend to people, there's a PDF, which I don't know, Clara, if you can find, called Engineering the Filecoin Economy, which it's like a 30-page PDF, so it's quite long. But I think it's actually quite useful for thinking about, and I think this is generally as a frame for thinking about crypto, where it's like, I think people very often fall into this trap of thinking of like crypto networks as sort of like this transactional thing versus like we're actually building an economy. And I think the difference there is like there's many different services that can and will exist inside of the Filecoin ecosystem, the same way that there's many different services that exist in the Ethereum ecosystem. And there's places where you want trade between these ecosystems and you want like intersection between them. And so I think like, for me at least, that's like a really good encapsulation of like how to think about one, like the Filecoin network, because it also goes into very good detail about like how does Filecoin work without getting into necessarily all the technical sides, but it like explains the motivation and how things intersect. But then also, I think it's just a good frame if you're trying to look at any other ecosystem as well. Like think of it as an island economy. How does that economy talk to other economies in the same way that you would analyze like real world countries? Think about it the same way for like crypto networks.
Awesome, thank you.
And I did want to share, I just put in the chat, definitely have all the organizers email Filecoin primer that covers everything on Filecoin fundamentals, the vision for 3.0, how to actually Filecoin, so basic blog resources, how to maximize Filecoin's mission, so some of the ideology and ethos behind it. So I put it, but we're working on an updated version of this, but please definitely do check that out as well. Yes, and that Filecoin economy document is also terrific, just describing the crypto economics of it. So
Thank you. Definitely share those around.
Amazing. Yeah, this was overall a great talk. Thanks everyone for doing this. I have just one last quick question. Clara, you mentioned that the Filecoin Foundation is hiring, but I was wondering also if you guys have bounties out there. Are you on Gitcoin? Are there any other like tangential ways that like people that want to contribute can do it without like getting like super involved or like getting hired, I guess?
yeah, absolutely. I love that question. We have so many ways to give money. I think that's what really bounty means. Like whether you want Filecoin, whether you want a fraction of Filecoin, whether you want USD or some fiat, right, in another currency. So we have a couple bounties. We have a bounty for storage providers, just thinking about tooling. If you're interested in getting involved there, there's a number of areas that you can solve in our storage provider bounty board. I can share the link afterwards, but it's on our GitHub account, which is just Filecoin community and is GitHub something Filecoin community. We'll find a link for you. We also have a bounty program for our security program. So if security is your background, we actually pay 10x the price for our security bounties in Ethereum, as an example. We actually pay very handsomely. So if you are looking to be a security researcher, definitely look at our security bounties. It's a huge opportunity. We have a couple of grant programs. The first we have is micro grants. These are small grants where if you're just looking to get started, you want to build, fun app or some interesting product, we'll give you a micro grant. We also have what we call developer grants. Sometimes there's RFPs, request for proposals, where there are things that you can build, or you can also submit an open proposal for ideas. So for example, a few cycles ago, someone wanted to do a social media network for all the storage providers. And so they built that, and we gave out a developer grant for that, right? And so to date, we've had over 100 developer grants that we've given out over the last year, and even more to count. We also fund a number of hackathons. We've touched, I think, over 10,000 developers this last year alone in our ecosystem, just through hackathons alone. And there are so many ways to get involved at the hackathon level. We have a number of blog posts to just tell you how many hackathons are ongoing. I think this month alone we have 5 or 6, or even more than that, and then plus a number of activities at major crypto or blockchain conferences. And then we also do investments. So if you are looking to be a startup founder or create a next company that's built on Filecoin, we will be launching very soon. I think applications are open now for our Techstars Accelerator that's launching in Seattle. And so if you really, startups are your life and blood and what gives you passion, definitely check those out. We have tons of accelerators, doesn't matter where in the world you're located. There is something there for you. So, and then also if you have other ideas about how we can improve our ecosystem, definitely let us know. JP and I can share emails. We can definitely answer additional questions, knowing that time is limited today.
Unfortunately, I see one last question actually. Hatien asks, how do we contact you guys for internship opportunities? I guess, Alexis, there you go. job@field.org.
I think both work. We try to make sure people who can't, who spell it plural and singular can can still use
Makes sense. All right. Well, it's great to hear that you're hiring interns as well. This is it doesn't happen often in the space, given how like the barriers, I guess, for recent grads. So thanks for being inclusive, because there's also a lot of students at universities that are very interested in go work for Filecoin rather than Amazon, which I think is pretty important. So thanks for that. I think we're wrapping up. This was a great hour, great event. I want to thank you guys again. Thanks, Marie and Annie, for moderating. Thanks, JV and Clara for attending and donating this hour of your time to us. Now we're gonna transition to networking.